a lot of the time people have the tendency, at least in my experience, to do that kind of waterfall approach and go for the crystal palace from the beginning,
Yeah.
when really they just need to lay down a couple bricks to start.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when those few bricks are down, people are like, wow, this is helping me already, right?
Mm.
And that gives you the time, the breathing space to get to that perfect picture at the end. Yeah, I don't know what the typical biography is for someone in sales operations, but I think mine is kind of odd the way I got here. So I was an academic previously, so I have my PhD in history, and I was intending on being a professor, and that didn't work out. So I thought, okay, what else can I do in life? What do I have the skills for? And I thought, well, I'm really good at understanding problems. I'm really good at explaining them to people, and I'm not scared to talk in public because I was giving lectures in the past.
Yeah.
So I said, let me try a career in sales. So I got my first sales job after university. I was working for a small security company. And I wouldn't say it was an ideal job. It wasn't an ideal sales environment either, but I learned a lot because it wasn't ideal. So it was literally, here's the phone book, start calling, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you've had a job like that before, but they're not the most fun. But to be successful in that job, you got to kind of more or less figure out for yourself. You obviously can't start at A and then end at Z, right? You're never going to make any money that way. So I had to kind of figure out a few things on my own. I started digging into sales technology a little bit on my own, whatever free tools we had to make it easier. We had a pretty rudimentary CRM, and I said, let me see if I can turn this around for myself and make it easier to sell. So I picked up a few skills here and there along the way. Had an opportunity to change jobs. So I went to go work for LexisNexis, which I think you saw on my LinkedIn, as a transition specialist. So then it was a little bit, not so much direct sales, it was helping customers convert from one version of the software to another. There was a little bit of sales activity because we were upselling along the way, but much lighter sales. That environment was also not very structured. So you're going to start seeing the theme is I go into an environment that's chaos, and then I say, is there a way we can make it run better?
Yeah.
So in that environment, we had no tools for tracking any of our activities. And the managers kept asking us for all these manual reports of like, how many calls have you done? How many were successful? And I'm like, this is ridiculous. Every day we're compiling this.
Yeah.
So again, very hacky, not very fancy. I wrote a bunch of macros in Excel so we were all independently tracking all our activities in Excel workbooks, and I had macros running and collecting them all together into one master and preparing automatic reports for them. That report caught the eye of the sales operations manager at the time, and he started asking me to do a couple of jobs for him here and there on the side. Eventually, there was an opening actually in compensation analysis on his team, which I jumped in, did that same deal. I mean, the previous compensation analyst wasn't doing a good job, so my first job was to audit all of his work. I found about $45,000 worth of unpaid commissions.
Wow.
They let him go, unfortunately. They put me in his position. I took that, I optimized that for another year or so, and then I was promoted to an operations analyst. And then finally from there, I made my way over to point-click care. And I guess it was from there on that I was working, more typically just in sales ops.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. Now, because I'm a history grad myself, I just have to touch on this. I mean, it's interesting because people wouldn't typically, and this is incorrect, but they wouldn't typically align a history degree with a data analyst role. So I'm interested, what was your PhD on, and what kind of transferable skills did you learn in the world of data analysis and ops?
Yep. So my PhD was on medieval economic history.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about transferable skills, you might not think there's a lot of transferable skills because most people say, what were you studying? How many chickens it takes to get a goat? And I said, no, that wasn't it. So basically I was studying the laws around lending money in the Middle Ages. So there was a religious law against lending money at interest in the Middle Ages. And then basically, as you know, no one will lend money without interest. So my PhD was all the ways that they managed to get around that prohibition without technically violating the law. And it was focused in particular on this one writer on that topic called John Freiberg, who was a Dominican friar, who wrote a book about how to interrogate people in confession. And that was one of the topics, how to interrogate them on whether they had lent money at interest.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I find we're going off a bit of an aside here, to do it. I find medieval history is so interesting because there's so many gaps in the story. It's up to you and your interpretation to fill those. And maybe that's a bit like sales ops sometimes when we have gaps in the data and we have to try and fill it to create a narrative and understanding of what's going on. So that's really awesome. Thank you for sharing. Okay, the first real question is, let's start with the metrics. So what metrics do you really focus on as the core of your revenue function and understanding?
Yeah, so my approach, I'm not sure how standard it is, but I tend to take a more minimalistic approach because in my experience, both executives and reps, they have a limited attention span. They can only watch so many things at the same time. So I want them to watch the things that matter the most, right?
Yeah.
And so we have a few key metrics. So obviously, bookings, I'm not even going to talk about because bookings is a standard metric across the board. But we say, what are the key metrics in order to get to a successful bookings number? So what we look at are really a couple things. So we look at pipeline generation and pipeline coverage. So pipeline generation, every rep has an individualized pipeline target based on their historical metrics. So or surrogates if they're new reps. So based on historical data, I can figure out what their length of sale is, what their average win rate is. I use all of that information to calculate a pipeline target, which is basically the inverse of their win rate and then phased according to their length of sale. So then I can figure out, okay, if you got to get to these bookings phased over this seasonality, I can step back and get the pipeline generation target you need to get to those bookings across that seasonality. So do the reps understand how the target is created? I explain it to them every year. Maybe they don't, but it has worked so far, right? So obviously, you're going to see seasonality, for example, next year. Seasonality slopes up and to the right? Because we've got the coronavirus pandemic going now.
Yeah.
We're expecting a slowdown in Q1 and Q2 and pick up towards the end of the year. Their pipeline generation targets are the inverse. So, you got to surge up towards the end of the year. That means you got to build the funnel at the beginning of the year. So they have dashboards in BI where they can track everything on this. They can track how much they're generating, so by volume and value, for what products, right? Measured against their target, compared year over year, so they can have a really accurate view of how am I doing on filling the funnel. Yeah. So that's one side of it. Now the other side of it is, okay, you're filling the funnel. How much funnel do you have available to cover your budget? And that's the pipeline coverage metric. So again, all of this is in BI. They have a dynamic view of here's your gap at any given point during the year, and the gap recalculates every time they make a sale. Yeah. Here's the amount of pipeline you have to cover it. What's your ratio of pipeline to gap? And then they know what their ideal ratio is based on their win rate, which also appears up in the report, so they can say, are you doing well or poorly versus your ideal ratio? And it's a warning system to the reps. It's a warning system to the sales directors. So they can say, oh, you're significantly under your coverage ratio, right? What's happening? So typically what happens is the director goes and looks at the coverage. They say you're under your ratio. Then they go, boom, straight over to pipeline generation. And they say, where's it coming from? So I think those are really the two key ones that we look at. And you see, as I was talking, we kind of backed in a couple other metrics as well in order to just look at those two.
Yeah.
But those are the keys, really. And that's what we talk about constantly in every call.
Yeah, okay, great. So this is great. It focuses a lot on reps, and they seem to be the foundation of the metrics you use to understand your business. So I'm just curious why you chose to take this kind of focus and what that brings to your ops game.
Yeah, so I think somewhat unique, at least based in my experience about my path, is I was a quota carrying rep at one point.
Yeah.
And understanding the sales job from the ground up, I feel to me has been incredibly helpful because you know as a rep what matters, what the psychology is, what capacity you have for taking in information that's outside of your day job. Because the problem is, as a rep, and I think I saw in your resume you have some experience also in sales. You're just constantly inundated with information and tasks, right? So adding on a couple extra layers from sales ops, you can do it, but it better be important information that's going to help you do your job. Yeah. That's why I took that rep focused approach, because when they look at it and the reps tell me, they say, this is helpful. This helps me to see where I'm at and how I'm going to be successful. And the reps at the end of the day, they're your source for success. Like, I haven't found a product yet that really sells itself. And if it did sell itself, you wouldn't need a sales team. You'd be like Netflix and you would just click a button and buy it, right? But for me, there's no B2B product that really sells itself. You need a sales rep. Sales rep's your cornerstone for success. So set them up to be successful. Your sales team will be successful.
Yeah, okay, this is great point here, because you're right. Sometimes a new process or new metrics can feel like a distraction for reps. Now, clearly you've gotten to the stage where you've had the affirmation that they find it useful, but before then, how do you convince them that the processes you're trying to get them to do and the metrics you're trying to get them to look at are worth doing and important? How do you do that discussion piece?
Yeah, so I was lucky there because I had experience as a teacher from my academic background. You got to be a good teacher, right? And for someone to do something, they have to really understand the why. Like if you just show them this and you say, well, if you're in the red here, you're bad, so do better. They're not going to really care about it. They're only going to care about it in the 5 minutes that the manager talks to them about it during the cadence every week. But if you say, you know, guys, this is important because if you're failing here, you're not going to hit your budget there. You're not going to hit your accelerator there. You're not going to make as much money there. So put in the upfront work in order to make the big money later. And then they click in right away like, this helps me, right? Following this stuff, it's not an exercise. It's not Big Brother checking over me. This is intended for me to check my business so I know that I can make some money in the future.
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. Now, going beyond the sales reps, and we're starting to look upwards here, to what extent do you think the metrics you've chosen bridge the operation/strategy divide? So how effective do you think they've been in getting you there?
I think those are primarily tactical metrics. I mean, we do, you said, what are the most important ones? The most important ones, to be honest with you, are the tactical ones that get you through the year, right? The strategic ones are important, but you know, I don't want to seem too bleak, but we live month to month, quarter to quarter, and year to year, right? This year is more important than the next 3 years in terms of you got to hit this year in order to make it to the next 3 years.
Yeah.
We do look at other strategic metrics, of course, but you're asking which ones are the most fundamental, right? So those are the most fundamentals to make sure your day-to-day business is going along. On the strategic side, that's me mostly working on the executive level, not so much with the reps.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, this is actually part of a really great discussion in ops right now, and people always somewhere on that spectrum between tactical and strategic. Now, really, you've explained this in part, but let's go into further depth. Like you said, you have to hit your month quota before you make it to next month. You have to hit your numbers before you get that promotion, and the business won't be here in 3 years if you don't make it in this year. So it's great for you just to explain a little bit more about why we should take a tactical approach to sales ops and possibly why that might simplify our lives as a sales ops leader.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. So, I mean, here's a question. I just wondered if you had a story about a rep that you've coached or some sales enablement that you've done with a rep and where you've used data and where it's really helped that turn that rep around.
Yeah, that's a good question.
You've gotten a B rep to an A rep, or you've gotten an A rep to outclass themselves. And let's just hit John.
Yeah, I can think of one example off the top of my head. So one of the key things that I did, it's not a metric, but from a tactical perspective for reps to be successful. So it wasn't a metric, but it was a tool I created for the reps for being able to see their white space for our in-base customers dynamically at any time. So they can see, that's something I've always had missing in all the previous jobs I've done, is saying, where can I go just click and see this is what the customer has, what it's left to sell them, and what are the best things to sell to them based on their profile. So all of that data was all over the place at my current company. And anytime it had to be done, it was only ever done as an executive exercise to prepare for strategic planning. It was never done as a tool to help the reps. Reps are always manually cobbling this together. I said, this is ridiculous. This should be point and click. So I said, okay, I'm going to make it point and click. Made it all, did even some geolocation on it, which is nice because we have a multi-location type approach. So we sell to orgs that have multiple locations. And usually you work from the locations up to the org. So it was really helpful to the reps to see all of their clients mapped out, primarily in the US, and they could see proximity to each other, as well as portfolio for each facility. So we deal with facilities, as well as what's available to sell them, so they could rapidly identify themselves clusters of potential opportunities.
Mm.
Having built all this, I did train this one rep who was one of our inside sales reps how to use it really well, how to focus on the map. And this rep was you know, he was never a bad rep. He was kind of middle, maybe middle high. But then he started blowing it up, right? And he found his niche. And what his real niche was is he became, we call him the upgrade king, right? So previously, figuring out what you could upgrade a customer from and to was a ridiculously challenging exercise. Now he did was he said, okay, I'm going to create my target list, which is easy. I go into John's report, I say, find everyone on this package, and it filters it immediately. I can see them all mapped out. I can go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, and get them all to buy in on going to the premium package. And that's what he's been doing all year, and he's been above quota all year.
That's incredible. That's really incredible. Now, behind a process change like that, or behind any kind of metric report, there are people. There are sales ops people, there are sales reps, and there are sales leaders. How do you plant the seed when you want to implement a new process? How do you get those discussions going from a leadership level?
So again, from my sales days, I learned the lesson that it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. So if I think it's important, and I have good reason, you know, I do sit and put some thought into it, because obviously I put myself on the line if I go off on my own direction. But I do it, right? So on the upsell white space, for example, that was a project that I was working kind of on the QT on for, I don't know, 1 month, month and a half, while I was juggling my other responsibilities. And then I just released it one day. And then, you know, my gamble paid off because the ELT and all the reps said, wow, this is a game changer, right? I mean, do you always do that? No. Obviously, I consult with my boss on what the key priorities are, and I make sure I'm tackling those key priorities. But sometimes you do have to be maverick, right? Because sales operations is not a well understood part of the business. Like, especially if you compare sales operations and business operations, right? A lot of people have a much better idea what business operations is about compared to sales operations. So sometimes they don't know what they can ask you to do. So you have to push rather than, you know, wait for that top-down guidance.
Yeah, really fantastic. Okay, well, it sounds like you've got a really good process in place. Like you said, you've found where areas of the business needs further analysis, and you've been successful in implementing those. So I'm curious, do you think you're ever going to review your metrics? And if you did, what would that look like? I mean, what kind of processes would you need to put in place, and what kind of strategic decisions would you be making?
Yeah, so that is a very good question. So reports are never really set it and forget it, right? Like we talk about creating reports that are set it and forget it, and that is the goal. So you have the constantly refreshing, constantly up-to-date report, but they're never truly set it and forget it in the sense that they're like, okay, this report's one and done forever. So right now I have a lot of really good reports, right? They're spread out in a bunch of different locations. What I don't have is so I work at a company called Point Click Care. So I joke to myself, I say, I don't have point click insight yet, right? I want to get to that point where within, let's say 5 to 10 clicks, I've got my insight, right? Now I'm like maybe, I don't know, 15 to 20 clicks to get to my insight. And I might be in 5 or 6 reports. So one of my key priorities for next year is transforming my reporting suite into, you know, we're calling it a system of intelligence, right? So I've got unified views, for example. So right now, if you want to check, for example, bookings performance versus pipeline coverage, you're in 2 different places. I want to be in a place where I can see the start to the end of the funnel in one place. So I can drill down on one rep and see all key metrics going at the same time. That's where I think that there's always room for improvement, is how can you take your data and transform it to insights? And that's a constant process of auditing. And it involves a lot of different stakeholders, right? So that's not just up to me. It's not me working in the ivory tower alone. It's going to the SD saying, how would you like to look at it? And then every SD is different. So figuring out how do I find something that will be happy, that will make all of them happy, right? Going to the VPs, right? The VP has a different view than the SD. How do I get this to be a way that's easy for them to access this information?
Yeah, I mean, this also brings up a really good point I wanted to touch on. You know, salespeople are increasingly becoming data-led. But you might say, other than people like yourself, it's not necessarily the bastion of their skill set, what they might do on a day-to-day basis. So how do you have data-led conversations with sales leaders so that they can understand the data properly, aside from being so busy in their day-to-day life with everything else they're doing in sales?
Yeah, that is a good question, and it is a challenge you face all the time, because you're right. It's not their first skill set yet, right? But it is becoming increasingly so. So there's a couple things that help you. One, overall in the market, that's a trend. Everyone knows to be a sales rep today, you got to be 10 times smarter than you had to be 20 years ago, right? So they all know that, they all kind of get it. So they're a little bit more open to having that conversation. But key to getting them to that, to that, like, this matters moment, is showing them why it's important, how it can affect your game, right? So for example, we have ideal customer profile data that shows we sell into healthcare. So there's publicly available information on how they're performing on a variety of healthcare metrics. We cross-reference that automatically against the upsell white space. So you can say they're suffering on 3 out of these 5 metrics. These 2 products address those 3 out of the 5 metrics. Make that connection between the 2 of them, and you've got an easy sale, right? You know, I put it easy, right? And it's never really that easy, but you've got a much easier sale than if you're going in cold and you're not asking the right questions. So if they get it that you're saying all of this data is so you can ask the right questions, so you can accelerate that sale, so you can improve the conversion rate, they're like, why wouldn't I do this, right? This saves me doing 50 calls. This saves me pissing off a prospect because I didn't understand what their key priorities were. I know in advance what their key priorities could potentially be, and I'm asking smart questions.
Yeah, okay. So you're almost getting predictive with your customer base, which is really smart. And now, how do those conversations with sales leaders go as a process? Is this something you sit down with every month, every quarter? How do you make sure this is regular?
Yep. So we do have a variety of touch points. So we do have a sales leadership call that takes place every 2 weeks, where there's routinely an operations update. I'm also fortunate that my current boss, the CSO, he's also very analytically minded. So now I have a lot of support, which I didn't always have in my career. Like sometimes I was kind of going off on my own and pushing this stuff and saying, this is why it's important. Now I'm lucky because I'll push the stuff, I'll say it's important, and he gets it in advance, right? So he says, yeah, go, just do it, right? So he gives me a lot of space to talk on those calls, and people just notice the difference, right? They say, thank you for getting us this information, because I saved X amount of time where I used to find all this stuff manually, or I never even knew to look for this stuff before, and how it could impact my job.
Yeah, okay, great. I mean, that brings up another point here. You're talking about how much you can help teams and the difference you can have in revenue. And it makes me think about, where is sales ops going, and where does it sit now currently in an organization? We hear loads of models like the spokes and hub model. What role do you think sales ops plays in an organization in the big picture view?
I think what I'm trying to do, at least in my role, is change it actually from some sales ops role, because sales ops is a little bit restrictive, to what I call sales intelligence. So, I've heard business intelligence, right? What are the insights that drive the business toward success? I think there's a more carved out role for sales in that, right? So how can you use data and processes to transform the sales department so it's a well-oiled machine? And that's where I think you're getting away from just the reporting side or just the technology side to a holistic view of saying, here's data, here are systems, here are people, here are processes, here's the whole unified view. And here's how, if I get the synergy between those pieces, we can run much faster than we're running today.
Yeah. And it's a simple question, and the obvious answer might be more revenue, but what's the impacts of running faster?
Yeah, and you're right. So that is the obvious answer. So that's the key goal, is to accelerate revenue. But I think some of the auxiliary goals that go along together with it are, it's a better user experience for the sales rep, right? So when the sales rep is happy, when the sales rep doesn't feel like they're doing useless information, so they're more productive, which is good because more productive means more revenue. But you also get better retention, better coaching from that rep to other reps, right? Because they don't feel like they're doing fruitless activity. They feel like what they do is important, and they feel smarter too, right? When they figure out how to use the data to access the client base, they say, wow, this is much better than what I was doing previously. and they want to spread that information to the other reps as well. That's what you see is sometimes you get a few key reps who adopt, and then they start spreading it to the rest of the team.
Yeah, I'm interested in that one, John. Is that a process you formalized, or is it one that is just seeding up from the ground?
I wouldn't say I've formalized it yet. I do, whenever I release a new initiative, I know who my key people are who are going to be interested in it, and I do leverage them. But I wouldn't say I've formalized it yet. But that's a good idea, right? Is to start formalizing it, to start with the super user group and spread out to the rest.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so when John closes his laptop at night and when he stops work and he goes to bed and he's thinking, how do you measure the success of the metrics you've chosen, and how are you confident that they are the right metrics to use? I think we touched a bit on this earlier, but let's tackle it properly.
Yep. So sadly, when I do close the laptop, I still am thinking about sales operations. I wish I could turn it off, but sometimes it does trickle over into the dreams. How do I know that I'm being successful? I watch the success of the team, right? I say, okay, so what's happening? We've got the same reps. We're selling the same products. If their activity is spiking, right? If the conversion rate is improving, if we're getting more bookings, and I see that those bookings are related to data that I've passed to them, I know that I'm doing my job correctly. And there's a couple cases you use just as like anecdotal validations where you're involved in a big deal and you directly accelerate that big deal if you're working with the rep. Then I'm like, yes, I know what I did mattered. So I think that's how you measure it. But that's a good point. It is very tricky to measure what the actual impact is of sales operations. Everyone knows you need to have it, but they're never quite sure why you need to have it. And I think if you can continuously show that the reps value the contribution, you can demonstrate the difference in the metrics. You can create a correlation, right? You can't say causation. You can't say the work I did caused this spike, but you can say it's a contributing factor, right? Similar to enablement, like how do you measure the results of sales enablement? It's very tricky. But if you've got an enable department that's humming along and the metrics are improving, the reps are staying with the company, the ramp time is decreasing, you know that they're doing something to improve it.
Yeah, great answer. Great answer. Okay, well, earlier we said that there is no textbook for sales operations, and one of the ways we learn is through making mistakes. So I was wondering what mistakes you might have learned from that you could share with the community.
Yeah, there are lots of mistakes. I would say the key thing that I've learned is when to say no. When you're early on in your career, and it is challenging, especially when you're early on in your career, because you tend to have it say like, I'm going to do anything to make my boss happy. But not everything that someone asks you to do is worthwhile. And especially typically when you're early on in your career as a sales operations analyst, it's mostly reporting. Sometimes you will get requests for ridiculous reports that take, significant effort to prepare. Then you get it out there, you put it in the hands of the stakeholder, and you think, what did I do all of that for? It didn't add any value to anything. It was to answer someone's curiosity, right? So I think that's one thing you learn is, and that's actually something my boss helped me with a bit, is he said, everything you do, focus on the impact it's going to have on the sales organization. So if it has no impact, don't do it, right? Understand in advance what the impact is going to be of doing this work. And I think that's something and to be honest with you, I'm going to say this, maybe some younger people are going to read it and it will help them a little bit, but they're always going to get pulled into that a little bit because they're junior in their role, right? And it's hard to say no at the beginning, but it is important to ask the right questions. So even if you're junior in your role and someone's asking for a ridiculous report and you think in your head, what's the point of doing this? Ask them, what are you hoping to find out? What question is this going to be the answer to? And then sometimes they will kick in their head and they'll say, I don't have the question. Someone just asked me for this information, right? Yeah. Even for them, sometimes they have no idea why they're asking for it. Someone else asked them for it, right? So I think if they can ask those questions, get probing. And obviously when you're a little bit more senior, you can say, listen, let's pause here for a second, right? And say, this is going to take me a long time, which is going to take me away from doing this, right? Why should we do this? I think that's important. Always ask those questions. Why are we trying to find this information?
Yeah, I mean, that's great, John. It sounds like you're using your sales experience and your questioning in your sales ops role today, which is powerful stuff. Here's one. If you were in a room full of sales ops leaders, and let's imagine the best in the world, what questions would you ask?
I would ask them, how do you move into predicting rather than reporting? How do you move into looking
Mm,
at the future instead of history, right? I mean, you know as well as I do, you've got the history background. The best predictor of the future is the past, right? But most of sales operations is spent analyzing the past, and I wouldn't say being reactive because the work we do does inform what people do in the future. But how do you have
mm,
a more targeted impact on the future? Like, how can you see the moves that are coming in advance based on the history? And you know that the whole world is tending in that direction, right? But this is something that we could really use in sales operations. How do we leverage the data in order to answer questions before they even come up, right?
mm,
And that's where I think, that's where I'm trying to go with my department. And it takes a long time to get there, right? You need to understand,
mm,
so the other thing I've learned at least is that there's no way you can get there productively unless you have a really good grasp on your history. Unless you have a really good grasp on the existing business, the predictive side will never do anything for you. It's just going to be a buzzword. I don't know how many times in your career you've heard people talk
mm,
about big data. Most of the time, people have no friggin'
mm,
idea what they're talking about when they say big data. They just say, yeah, big data is going to solve the problem. I'm like, they don't even know what it means, right? I
mm.
think that's what I would like now. How do we use those analytics that in a way to create impact in the future?
Yeah, I think that's an outstanding question. And like you say, moving towards that predictive model is something everyone in ops is trying to solve right now, right? Because how much extra time does that buy your business and buy your sales team? It's a great point to raise for other people to think about as well. Well, John, if you could share one message with the sales ops community right now, what would you want to tell them? Might be a bit cheesy, but it might be something someone else really needs to hear at the moment.
Based on my experience, I would say whenever you're working on a new initiative in operations, walk first, then crawl, then run, right? And the reason I say that is a lot of the time you're asked to do really complex projects, and it may take you 6 months, a year to get to the outcome that they're asking for because you're trying to do everything perfect up front. If someone has to wait for that value for a year, they're going to forget why they asked you to do it in the first place. And they're going to say, why is it taking so bloody long to get done? If you can say, this is the goal you're trying to get to, and I can deliver 30% of this goal by this date, but you can use that 30% right away, 50% of the goal by this date, and you can use it right away, and then the remainder by this date, and then you've got the perfect solution. Then people are like, okay, I've got something right away that's helping me. I've got something that's a little bit better now, and now I've got something that's best in class. A lot of the time, people have the tendency, at least in my experience, to do that kind of waterfall approach and go for the crystal palace from the beginning,
Yeah,
when really they just need to lay down a couple bricks to start.
yeah, yeah.
And when those few bricks are down, people are like, wow, this is helping me already, right?
Mm,
And that gives you the time, the breathing space to get to that perfect picture at the end,
yeah.
which I guess is never really perfect, but as close as you can get.